In this video, I want to talk about the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. And so we're going to look at the anatomy and the physiology, a bit of physiology of both of these. So really focusing on these first three learning outcomes, right? Identifying spinal nerves as those that sort of correspond to the vertebrae they emerge from, or emerge from in between, and then identifying the different pieces of the spinal cord anatomically, and talking about how those anatomical regions differ physiologically, and then we'll look at a couple of sections of a spinal cord, and incoming and outgoing nerves. Okay. Okay. So first, I just want to remind you of the divisions of the nervous system. These anatomical divisions are the central and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is here in yellow. It's the brain and the spinal cord, and any cells that have their cell bodies in these regions are said to be part of the central nervous system. Um, then we have, in the central nervous system, its job is information processing, right? So any information that needs to be processed, simple sensory information, both from the external environment and internal environment, that goes to the central nervous system for processing. And we're going to talk later about some really simple processing that goes on just in the spinal cord and actually doesn't involve the brain at all, although the brain typically does learn about it, um, or hear about it later. Uh, there are also complex processing that goes on, and that happens in the brain. And the clusters of interacting cells here that we find in spinal cord and brain are called nuclei. And then the rest of this in orange is the peripheral nervous system. This is all peripheral nerves, so sensory neurons that are carrying information toward the spinal cord. Those are all part of the peripheral nervous system. Even and multiple motor neurons that are just out here are part of the peripheral nervous system. Um, we're going to see that components of the spinal nerves and a couple of these, not all, but some of these cranial nerves here are part of the peripheral nervous system. Right? And this is really the information relay system of the body. So all the sending of information to and from this central processing center, that's all part of the peripheral nervous system. And here we have clusters of nuclei here just outside of the spinal cord, for example, on either side. Those are called ganglia because they're in the peripheral nervous system. If they were in the central, they'd be called nuclei, though they don't really differ in any other way except for location. Okay. So here's a couple of images of the spinal cord. Here we have our brain and spinal cord, and this is color coded in terms of the cervical vertebrae. You can see these blobs are the vertebrae, and then you can see emanating from the vertebrae are nerves, right? And so these nerves start with uh, the with C1, the first nerve emanating just above that first cervical vertebrae. Right, you can see all seven vertebrae here, all seven cervical vertebrae here, and then C8 kind of bracketing it and coming out just underneath the seventh cervical vertebrae. Now, with all the rest, for example, the first thoracic vertebrae emerges underneath the the first thoracic nerve emanates underneath the first thoracic vertebrae rather than on top of it, and the first lumbar nerve comes out under the first lumbar vertebrae, and same with sacral. Right, so the cervical is just a little bit different. So if you were to see, any nerves emanating from between thoracic vertebrae or between cervical vertebrae, you'd know which nerves they were. They're either cervical, thoracic, lumbar, or sacral nerves. Right. Now, each of these, this is showing, of course, in longisection. If we rotate that a little bit, we're still seeing longisection, but now we're seeing it from the back, from the posterior view. You can see that coming out on either side are these roots, nerve roots, and that's these pieces. That's these pieces right here, right? Those are the roots, and then after these roots sort of merge here at this junction, that's when we call them spinal nerves. So out here, right beyond this junction here, they would be called spinal nerves. Right? So we can see that these are coming all along the vertebral column. We have these. Now, once we get past this divergence here, if we're moving in toward the spinal cord, that's where we start to see the first sort of segregation of different parts of our anatomical regions of the nervous system. So all of the neurons in this nerve here, or this branch of the nerve, this root, are carrying sensory information toward the spinal cord, and all of these here in this ventral root are carrying motor information away from the spinal cord. Right? So in this region, it's all afferent. In this region, it's all efferent. And of course, out here in the spinal nerve, it's going to be a mix of those. Right? Okay. The other thing to recognize here is that we have this dark portion here in the center. That's our gray matter. And then this pale portion outside, this is white matter, right? All peripherally here, anteriorly, sorry, uh, yeah, posteriorly and anteriorly, right? This is all white matter. Okay, let's take a closer look at this. And again, the pathway of information, this is just taking a cut or a segment and popping it out. You can see here is a spinal nerve coming in, right? And then information would be diverging into this dorsal root. And here we have a dorsal root ganglia, and this is where we have cell bodies of sensory neurons. And then those branch into tiny little rootlets, but they're all carrying information to the gray matter of the spinal cord. And then here we have, somewhere in here, we have this information, these neurons, sensory neurons, synapsing with other neurons and sharing information. Maybe they go take it to the brain. Maybe they communicate with motor neurons down here in the ventral region. And then we have those motor neuron cell bodies right here, and then axons going out this ventral root off to join the spinal nerve. Right? Okay, so let's take another look at this a little bit closer. Here we're just we've just kind of taken this in cross section and just taken this little piece of it, right, to simplify things. Okay, so again, this here is termed gray matter, and out here is white matter. Why is that? Well, we alluded to this in your neural tissue video for lab. The gray matter consists of cell bodies of neurons and unmyelinated axons. Right? That's primarily what's in here, cell bodies and unmyelinated axons. So you do definitely have neurons with cell bodies here sharing information with neurons over here. And so you do have axons for sure crossing over, but they're not myelinated, and primarily because they're going a really short distance, right? We know that myelination is important for increasing the speed of action potential propagation, but this is just not going very far, so we don't need myelination here. The white matter is all myelinated axon. So while we have cell bodies here, we don't have cell bodies out here. We certainly have the cell bodies of glial cells that support the axons of neurons, but we don't have cell bodies of neurons. We just have myelinated axon, and that's why it appears white, is because it's mostly, or it's a lot of fatty tissue, which shows up as white, or looking like open space. If you remember our slide material that we looked at, fat kind of looks like nothing, right? Just blank space. So that's white matter, myelinated axon. Now, this is just a labeling to help you figure out when you see a cross-section of spinal cord, whether you're looking at the posterior or dorsal side or the anterior, right, or ventral side. And this sulcus here is quite a bit smaller than this very large and wide fissure, right? The anterior median fissure. Here's our dorsal root, right? Information's coming in through this dorsal root. Here's our ventral root. Information is leaving, right? And when I say information, action potentials, right? Action potentials are traveling along neurons in this root of this nerve, and action potentials are traveling along neurons in the root of this nerve. There's our dorsal root ganglion. For all sensory neurons that are propagating information to the spinal cord, this is where their cell bodies are, right? So this is where the cell bodies of sensory neurons are. Remember, we talked about the type of sensory, dominant type of neuron that is a sensory neuron is a unipolar neuron. So this is where the cell bodies of unipolar neurons occur, is right here. And then that information is propagated into this portion, the dorsal horn of the gray matter. So this is the dorsal horn of the gray matter because it's on the dorsal side. This is the ventral horn of the gray matter because it's on the ventral side. And so what you have here, now we've got further organizational differences. Here in the dorsal horn, you have the cells of sensory nuclei that are receiving information. So these are basically relay nuclei, right? Here is where we have the cell bodies of those sensory neurons. Those synapses on relay nuclei somewhere here in this dorsal or in this dorsal region of the gray matter, right? So these are really relay nuclei, not so much sensory nuclei. In fact, let me just change that or modify that a little bit for you. This is better. These are sensory neuron, sensory relay nuclei, right? So you have synapsing of a sensory neuron with some relay nuclei here, and there's two different colors, right? And let me talk about those in a second. Then you have the cell bodies of motor neurons here, right? And these are all the cell bodies of motor neurons here are. Now they could be doing a couple of things. They could be crossing over to the other side to affect motor output on the other side of the body, or they could be passing to the same side of the body, right? But this is where the nuclei for the motor neurons are. And remember, these neurons are giant multipolar neurons, right? Those are the motor neurons, giant multipolar neurons. What else do we have? A further segregation or organization into somatic and visceral. Okay, that's probably the first time we're hearing those words. So what is somatic that I indicated with an S? Somatic sensory neurons are those neurons that are relaying information that we end up generating a perception of. So we can feel the stimuli that are sensed by somatic sensory neurons. We would say that we feel it, right? Like that poking my finger, I am poking somatic sensory neurons. I am stimulating somatic sensory neurons. I can feel that, right? I'm forming a perception of what that feels like in my brain. I'm conscious of it. So those are somatic. So this is where all of those, if they do synapse, this is where they synapse with relay nuclei. And for motor nuclei, all the somatic motor nuclei, now that's an easy one too, right? Everything I'm doing right now that you're seeing me do, that's all the result of somatic motor neurons, right? They control skeletal muscle. Right? So somatic motor neurons control skeletal muscle. That's different from visceral, right? The visceral motor neurons are more internal here. Visceral sensory and motor neurons are more internal. Visceral sensory neurons are carrying information you are not conscious of. Your brain still still gets that information and does something with it, but you don't form a conscious perception of it, right? For example, visceral sensory neurons are right now sensing the amount of glucose circulating in my bloodstream, propagating that information to my brain. I have no idea what that is. I don't know how much glucose is in my bloodstream. Sensory neurons are telling me, are sensing the temperature of my blood uh, in a variety of places, right? A proxy for my body temperature. I don't know what that is. I don't have any sense for what the temperature of my blood is right now. Um, so anything that's unconscious, right? They are sensing. Visceral sensory neurons are communicating that information to this region of the spinal cord and synapsing with visceral sensory relay neurons. Same with visceral motor neurons, right? It's stuff you don't have control over, or even stuff you don't have control over. So neurons that connect to or that stimulate your heart to beat faster or slower. Right? You're not. I mean, you can try to make your heart beat faster right now. You can try to slow it down by thinking about it. You won't be able to do it, right? This is something we're not in control of. This is a visceral motor function. You can do it indirectly by, taking deep breaths and closing your eyes and, you know, uh, trying to clear your mind. You can do that indirectly, but not because you're saying, heart, slow down, right? That's not possible. Or sweating, right? Try to make yourself sweat right now by just thinking about sweating. You can't do that, but it is visceral motor neurons that are responsible for that. Or switch from burning glucose to burning fat. Do that. Go ahead and do that now. Try to do that. I want you to burn fatty acids metabolically. I want you to make ATP via fatty acid metabolism instead of glucose metabolism. You can't do that. But visceral motor neurons are responsible for doing those sorts of things, right? Sweating, secreting digestive enzymes, switching to fat lipolysis, fat metabolism, things that you're not in control of, right? And that's where visceral motor neuron cell bodies are. Still in the ventral gray matter, but more internal. Okay. All right, so this is just a kind of another view of it, a real slide showing the dorsal root ganglia. So here, incoming sensory information. Here's the cell body of that unipolar neuron. Here it is coming in. Now mm, uh, it's synapsing with perhaps a relay neuron here that might then go down here and synapse with a motor neuron here who has its cell body here, and then propagating out the ventral root, right? Um, so let's just draw that really quick and make sure that we've got a good handle on it. So here I've drawn a really poor example of a cross section of the spinal cord, but I just want to be able to show you these these incoming and outgoing neurons and where they synapse, right? So we said that out here in this more peripheral region is typically where we have our, let's do somatic, right? Somatic region is more peripheral. The visceral region is more internal, right? And then of course we have that segregation of, um, uh, sorry, I already goofed on that. This anterior region is somatic. Sorry. Okay. This dorsal region, right? Posterior region is sensory, right? And this ventral region is motor. Okay. So what does the wiring look like, right? We have incoming sensory neurons. These are unipolar neurons. So here they go. What do we have here in the dorsal root ganglion? It's a unipolar neuron. Dorsal root ganglion is where cell bodies are. So there's our cell body, right? Now let's say this is a somatic neuron, right? So it's going to be synapsing, and we'll see examples where it doesn't, but it's going to be synapsing, say, with a relay neuron, a somatic sensory relay neuron right here. Right? So there's the cell body, for example, of this somatic sensory relay neuron. That might be communicating just directly with a somatic motor neuron here in the ventral gray matter, right? So here's our motor neuron. What kind? Kind of neuron is this, or what type of neuron is this motor neuron? Yes, a giant multipolar neuron. So that is then carrying information out, right? So here we go in our spinal nerve. Here we go. We have information going both directions, right? We have incoming sensory information, we have outgoing, and that's basically right here, right? And we have outgoing motor information, right? This is made up of both unipolar sensory neurons and giant multipolar motor neurons. Incoming sensory information, the cell body is here, propagates to the sensory portion of the gray matter, right? Gray and white matter. So all this is myelinated. All that's myelinated. Synapses here with a somatic sensory relay neuron. This is now unmyelinated because it's in the gray matter. So unmyelinated axon synapsing with a giant multipolar uh, somatic motor neuron, and that neuron is carrying information out to skeletal muscle, the effector the only effector, right, of the somatic motor system is skeletal muscle, right? So, and this is all, of course, this is all myelinated too out here. All right. Okay. So that's kind of the breakdown of these sensory and motor neurons. Of course, if this were a visceral sensory and motor unit pair, then the synapsing would be here, right, and here. Those where the synapses would be, right? But the pathway of information into and out of the spinal cord would be exactly the same. Okay. Okay, thanks for watching. Please let me know if you have any questions about the anatomy or physiology or wiring here of the spinal cord, and I'll see you in a future video.